I just want to be friends, she said, as if friendship were a shelf she could move him to and he'd stay upright, dusted and available. Ethan heard the line land in the room like a glass set carefully on a table that still found a crack and broke anyway. He blinked once and thought about the night's specials still chalked on the board at the restaurant. Bourbon-glazed salmon, garlic confit chicken, burnt honey carrots. About the way the dining room lights made everyone look briefly softer than they were. Sure, he said, voice even, like he'd practiced it, like friendship had a script. She'd packed. 2 suitcases stood like witnesses by the couch. Vanessa's copper hair was pulled into a high knot that did nothing to tame the electricity in the air. She was 26, a marketing assistant who could sell a glass of water to the Cumberland River and make the river feel grateful. Tonight, her pitch was a gentle downgrade. "We're moving too fast," she said, the phrases polished by rehearsal. "I need to find myself. I don't want to lose you. You're important to me." Ethan watched the words roll out like well-meaning furniture that didn't fit the room. The apartment carried the residual warmth of a life they'd built, because it's hard to teach a home to stop behaving like a home on command. Notes still magneted to the fridge. A plant he'd finally learned not to drown. The couch that had learned their argument postures. He felt something unhook in his chest and reattach a few inches to the left. "Friends," he repeated, tasting the syllables for bitterness, finding none, only a clean edge. "Okay." He stood because staying seated made him feel like a problem waiting for a solution. "Friends support each other's decisions, right? I support your decision to leave." The sentence surprised them both with how gently it closed a door. Vanessa blinked, thrown off her mark. He expected pleading, maybe a flare of anger. She'd expected theater. Instead, Ethan moved through the room like a man who had chosen the next task. Call a locksmith, decimals for a tip out, the quiet math of closing and opening. "I've talked to Lindsay about staying with her," Vanessa added, careful, invoking best friend like a credential. The name landed, familiar and neutral. Ethan nodded. He felt not numb but precise. Shock has that effect. It sharpens the edges around what stays. Nashville's Music Row taught him pace and performance. In the kitchen, tickets stack, pans shout, the past glows like an altar. Managing a restaurant was a choreography of questions. 86 what, why table 7, where's the runner who needs water? It had made him good at assessing heat without catching fire. The skill translated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bargain. He took a breath and gave her the space she said she needed, like a waiter granting a table more time with the menu. "Text when you're settled," he said, and held the door. He could be kind without being a cushion. Friends, then. The next morning he did what roommates do when one moves out. Called the locksmith, updated the Wi-Fi, removed her from subscriptions, and the joint account that paid for toilet paper and olive oil. Not because he wanted to erase her, but because accounts require signatures that match. When she texted for the Wi-Fi password, he replied with the ISP's number. "They'll set you up in no time," he added, smiling at how much better policy felt than drama. Friendship, he thought, is clarity, not access. 3 days later she arrived with Chinese takeout like nostalgia might bribe the present. "Dinner and a movie," she sang, like old times were a coupon she could still redeem. Ethan stood in the doorway, the hall's light carving him into a polite silhouette. "Appreciate it," he said. "Already ate. Coffee this week." Her confusion looked almost tender. "Can I grab what I left in the bathroom?" "Of course," he said, and didn't move from the threshold. When she lingered, fingers hovering over frames still on the bookshelf, he said, "Early morning for me." He didn't slam a door. He demonstrated its function. He scheduled contact like he would any other friend. A coffee on Wednesday, a check-in text answered the next morning if it arrived at midnight. When she wrote long about being lost, he replied short about resources. "That sounds tough," he texted. "Lindsay is a good listener. Counselor could help too." He learned how to be present without being a pantry. When she suggested a movie night, he suggested daylight. When she floated the idea of a weekend at the lake as friends, he let the silence do what silence does best, clarify. Friday nights carried their own ritual. The group met at Murphy's. where neon signs promised music, and the bartender with the archer's tattoo remembered orders like scripture. That's where Ethan saw the first performance. Vanessa arrived with a man who wore his discomfort like a shirt a size too small. Connor, 24. A sound engineer who looked like he heard frequencies other people didn't. Vanessa laughed at nothing, touched Connor's arm like a nervous tell, glanced at Ethan between syllables. It was a one-woman show with a title he could read from the back row. See How Okay I Am. Ethan asked Sam about a new guitar pedal, asked Mara about the grad program, bought his own drink, and let the room carry him like a river that didn't need him to swim. When Connor made a decent joke about broken cables being metaphors for communication, Ethan laughed like the joke deserved. He felt the weird lightness of refusing to audition for a part he hadn't auditioned for in the first place. Vanessa's smile spiked and faltered. He wanted to be cruel and wasn't. He wanted to be noble and wasn't. He was a man at a bar on a Friday. It was enough. After Lindsay, shoulder-length blonde hair, eyes that didn't flinch, caught him by the door. "I'm impressed," she said, low enough that it didn't turn into a scene. "Most guys either burn the place down or camp on the porch." He shrugged, unsure what to do with approval he hadn't rehearsed. "She asked for friendship," he said. "I'm giving her friendship." Lindsay's smile didn't apologize for itself. "You're giving her boundaries. There's a difference." Her tone carried the gentle authority of a physical therapist who had taught 1,000 ankles how to trust the ground again. "Vanessa says you're cold," Lindsay added, not to gossip, but to name the weather. "From here you're just ordinary, which might be a miracle." It struck him then, the way crisis had trained him to look for highs and lows, to live in crescendos. How ordinary, handled with care, could be more radical than any speech. "Ordinary feels like breath I don't have to borrow," he said, surprising himself with the sentence, liking the way it fit. The restaurant ran hot Saturday. A bachelorette party that clapped between courses. Tourists who thought Nashville hot was a hashtag and not a warning. In the kitchen, Ethan called tickets, checked temps, pivoted a server away from a collision with a bus tub. Work was a mercy, tasks with edges, outcomes that respected effort. When Vanessa's text arrived at midnight, "Can you talk? I'm spiraling," he let the phone face down on the nightstand and slept. Morning found him intact. He replied at 10. "Morning, hope you got rest. Therapist could be a good place to bring this." Advice without adoption. He met the locksmith again on Monday to finish replacing the deadbolt on the back door. The man told him a story about a raccoon that had learned to open coolers. "Smart is not the same as wise," the locksmith said, twisting the cylinder into place. Ethan tipped well and thought of how many times he'd confused the two. He put the spare key in a small dish on the counter, his dish, his key, and felt the house exhale into its new shape. 2 weeks later at Murphy's, the play returned for an encore. Vanessa amplified everything, laugh, touch, happiness, turning the dial past believable into broadcast. Connor looked at his hands like they might explain something. Ethan didn't flinch. He asked the band about their set list, tipped the server who kept the water refilled without waiting for thirst. When he caught Lindsay's eye, she gave a small, private nod that felt like a check mark on a test he hadn't realized he was taking. After last call, the room emptied into the polite cold. Lindsay stood beside him under the awning where the rain stuttered, then decided to commit. "This might be complicated," she said, straightforward as a diagnosis. "Would you have dinner with me?" For a second, the street's neon softened, the air made room around the question. He saw not Vanessa's best friend but Lindsay, who had watched him be ordinary and found it worth her time. "I'd really like that," he said. The sentence clicked into place like a seatbelt, safety and forward motion in one gesture. They picked a quiet Italian spot downtown where the owner knew how to let couples be alone in company. Lindsay listened like a person who planned to remember, asked questions that didn't mind him for confessions. She told a story about an elderly patient who had learned to laugh again when his foot stopped hurting. "Pain shrinks the room," she said. "Relief opens a window." Ethan talked about burnt honey carrots and why bourbon behaves in a pan the way stubborn people behave in a room. They didn't check their phones. They looked like two people in a restaurant doing the simple work of attention. When he walked her to her car, the air had thinned into that hour when the city lowers its voice. The kiss was brief and declarative, punctuation rather than fireworks. "Let's go slow," she said, not as a rule but as a promise. "Slow sounds like a plan," he answered, and felt the plan lodge somewhere near his sternum and start to glow. 2 days later, a notification stack. Calls, texts, notifications piling like plates in a sink. Vanessa's name, repeated, louder in repetition. He answered on the 7th ring because some habits die considerate. "How could you?" she shouted, volume turned to invitation for an audience that wasn't there. "We're supposed to be friends. Friends don't date their best friend." Ethan looked out the window at a delivery truck struggling with the geometry of the alley. "You wanted friendship," he said evenly. "You're dating someone. Lindsay chooses for Lindsay, I choose for me." Negotiating with a storm teaches you about roofs. He did not leave his. That night he stared at the ceiling fan splitting the dark into manageable pieces and thought, terms and conditions. He had accepted friendship on terms he could live with. He had set conditions that kept him from becoming a resource. He had chosen an answer that did not audition for sainthood. When sleep finally arrived, it felt earned, like a tip counted by hand, bill by honest bill, the night's labor adding up to something sturdy enough to carry forward. The first lie arrived dressed as urgency. At 12:07 p.m. mid-lunch rush, Ethan's phone vibrated against the expo counter hard enough to rattle the ramekins. "Vanessa, I'm pregnant. We need to talk." He read it twice the way you read a check for too many zeros, set the phone face down, and called, "Fire 2 salmon, 1 medium on the confit." Because tickets do not wait for melodrama. When he answered between courses, his voice was the calm he had practiced since the suitcases by the couch. "If this is true," he said evenly, "we should go to a doctor together and make a plan." The next day she texted, "I lost it." He replied, "I'm sorry you're going through something hard." Then he put the phone in the drawer of the host stand for the rest of the shift and reminded himself that compassion doesn't require consent to a narrative. The second lie borrowed authority. During Thursday's dinner service, Anna, his assistant manager, hustled back to the pass with that particular half-grimace the front of house wears when chaos decides to tip. "Vanessa's on the phone," she said. "She says you're in crisis and someone needs to cover your shift." A lesser version of him would have cracked. This one nodded toward the ringing line. "I'm good," he told Anna. "If she calls again, tell her to email me." The cooks kept their rhythm. The plates kept landing like small victories on wood. He didn't run to the phone, he ran the line. The escalation obeyed its own logic. Attention is a currency, and some people learn to spend counterfeits when the real bills stop arriving. At Murphy's, Vanessa performed her new relationship like a setlist. Laughter turned to 11, hands on Connor like punctuation, glances thrown at Ethan like hooks that tried to catch. He refused to be the fish. He bought his own beer, tipped for the water refills, asked about Sam's demo, made a mental note to change the parchment paper supplier because the current roll tore at stupid angles. Lindsay drifted over after the fourth exaggerated punchline and said, "You are doing great," like a coach who understood the sport was patience. He didn't post photos of the date with Lindsay, but he also didn't hide it when she tagged the cappuccino, the two hands, hers and his, around a cup like a small planet worth sharing. 2 days later, the calls stacked again until the phone seemed to hum with a single word, betrayal. "Friends don't date their best friends," Vanessa shouted. Ethan kept his tone level, the way you keep a pan at a simmer. Enough heat to cook, not enough to scorch. "You asked for friendship," he said. "You chose to date. Lindsay can make her own choices. So can I." He hung up and wrote down the time of the call, the content in bullet points, a steady habit borrowed from the part of his brain that loves inventories and end-of-night counts. Then the in-person theatrics began. A Tuesday dinner service, pretzel not busy. He looked up from checking a mid-rare to see Vanessa at the host's stand. "I need to talk to you," she told the host. "It's an emergency." Ethan stepped out from the pass and kept the counter between them. "I'm at work," he said, voice neutral. "We can schedule a coffee in a public place." She started crying at volume, a sound designed to gather an audience. "You ruined my life," she said into a dining room full of people twirling forks and looking anywhere but where drama wanted them to look. "Anna," Ethan said without shifting his gaze, "please have security walk Miss Cooper out." The manager on duty nodded, professional compassion containing a situation. Afterward, he wrote the incident down, date, time, witnesses. He felt like a clerk for his own safety. He didn't like it. He did it anyway. Jake, his brother-in-law and a detective who'd seen the ways attention can grow teeth, sat at Ethan's kitchen table that night with a legal pad and a patience that looked like competence. "Document everything," Jake said, sliding the pad over. "Calls, texts, appearances, any third-party contact. Screenshots, timestamps. Don't engage in content beyond logistics. If she shows up, you don't open the door." He spoke without theater, which made the stakes feel real. "This is criminal harassment if it continues," Jake added. "Restraining orders are a tool. We'll use them if we have to." Ethan nodded. He had learned to salt food with 2 fingers. He learned to salt his life with documentation the same way, measured, deliberate. The garden variety mess of a breakup was becoming a map of lines he had to keep drawing. He met Lindsay at a park on a bench not designed for comfort. "Are we okay?" he asked, hating how high the question sounded in his chest. Lindsay looked straight at him in the way that made him feel like he was being seen rather than evaluated. "We are," she said, "but we need to be smart, public places, no late-night phone drama. If she shows at your door, you call Jake, not me," he nodded. "I hate that I'm bringing this into your life." "You're not," she said. "She is. My job is to help bodies heal without promising a timeline." Same applies here. The calls to the restaurant kept coming, inventive and insistent. He trained the team to route them to email. He drafted a simple statement. "For scheduling and HR concerns, please contact this address." He posted it by the phones like a talisman. When Vanessa tried the kitchen door, a dishwasher named Lewis, who had seen more than any 22-year-old should see, shook his head slowly as security guided her away. "People think back doors are for secrets," Lewis said later, mopping with brisk grace. "They're for inventory." Ethan laughed, grateful for the way kitchen wisdom kept surprise simple. Then came the clinic incident. Lindsay's call trembled at the edges, in the background, voices a-clatter. "She came to the clinic," Lindsay said, started screaming in front of patients, knocked over a rack. Security had to remove her. Ethan's stomach did the neat trick of turning into a fist. "Are you safe?" "Yes," shaken, angry. "I'm on my way," he said, then corrected himself. "I'll wait here so I don't escalate anything." "Jake's on his way." "Already here," she said, a steadiness returning to her voice with the name. After, in Lindsay's living room, knees touching, hands quiet, they let the anger arrive without feeding it. "I'm filing tomorrow," Lindsay said. "Protective order, enough." Courtrooms are less interesting than television promises, more fluorescent, more paper. Ethan sat beside Lindsay while a clerk with a voice like a stapler called names and case numbers. Jake had assembled the packet. Dates, times, screenshots, incident reports from the restaurant and the clinic, statements from staff who hadn't expected to become witnesses. The judge read, eyes moving in a way that said this was neither unique nor trivial. Temporary orders granted, service to be attempted. "It may get worse before it gets better," Jake had warned, and the warning did not feel like doom. It felt like weather report. "Bring a coat. Don't stand under trees in lightning." It did get worse. Vanessa's employer, who had tolerated family emergencies until the phrase lost meaning, let her go after 3 client meetings missed in a week that wasn't long enough for that many exits. Connor, who had been a prop and then realized props get stored, stopped replying. Rumors reached Ethan like water through pipes, muffled but directional. He didn't rejoice. He cut the bread for lunch service with cleaner strokes. He started locking his phone in the office during shifts, the way you lock up knives. Susan, Vanessa's mother, called. Her voice carried the exhaustion of a person rearranging furniture to avoid creaking boards in a house built on noise. "I'm so sorry," she said. "We saw the paperwork. We're getting her help." Ethan kept his reply narrow and kind. "I appreciate that." He hung up and sat in the office chair not designed for comfort, the spine of a manager who had learned to sit with numbers that don't lie. He allowed himself 1 minute to put his head in his hands and breathe, the way trainers tell you to breathe through a lift, down, up on purpose. He and Lindsay built something that didn't need to declare itself. They cooked. They watched the Predators lose and then win. They sat on the floor and went through old boxes as if memory were inventory to be counted but not retailed. "You know what I love about this?" Lindsay asked one night, leaning into the couch like it had earned the right to hold her. "We like each other as we are, not for the spectacle, not for the story, for the person." Ethan traced the rim of his glass. "Form before spectacle," he said, tasting the phrase that had steadied him on the line and now steadied him here. "Works in kitchens, works in love." 6 months. The temporary orders became longer. Reports quieted. Friends who had been cool returned to neutral, then to normal. Someone reported that Vanessa was in therapy with a counselor who refused to be impressed by tears and typed fast notes about entitlement and consequences. The drama that had once felt like weather became a forecast others read with their own umbrellas. Ethan updated the chalkboard, corrected a misspelling of cavatappi, wiped the chalk dust onto his apron, and felt the gorgeous boredom of a Tuesday service done right. On the anniversary of the night at Murphy's when Lindsay had asked the question with clean edges, Ethan took her back to the same bar. The neon still failed to decide whether to be hopeful or sad. He ordered 2 sodas because they had an early morning hike, because small choices had become their way of building big things. "You ready?" he asked. She laughed. "I thought I was." He took a breath that reached the bottom of his lungs and held the ring that had not belonged to a past but to a future he could name. When he asked, the room didn't hush. It didn't need to. She said yes without looking around to see who was watching. They didn't post the proposal, which felt like the point. Some moments are built to breathe, not to broadcast. Back at Ethan's place, the ring sat between them on the coffee table like a small planet with its own weather. And the house, which had learned the shape of silence during the worst months, learned how to hold laughter without flinching. Lindsay touched the band the way a therapist checks range of motion, gentle, precise, listening for pain that isn't obvious. "Feels like we made a thing that can carry weight," she said, and the sentence became their first shared object of the new life. Not a secret, not a slogan, just a measurement that felt true. They told people the slow way, by presence rather than announcement, letting the ring gleam when it wanted under restaurant lights or morning sun at the farmer's market. In the kitchen at work, Ethan wiped down the pass and realized the habit of counting tips had taught him more about joy than he expected. It adds up best when nobody's peacocking, when each small bill, each Tuesday, each call answered on time, each apology that doesn't audition, lands where it belongs. The staff hugged him in that shoulder-bumping way kitchens prefer and asked if the menu would get soppier now that the boss was engaged. He grinned and promised only an extra flourish of burnt honey on the carrots. Susan called again, voice steadier this time, the thinness of exhaustion replaced by a workable quiet. "I heard you're engaged," she said, making space for congratulations without pretending the past hadn't been loud. "We are," Ethan said, and let the tone be respectful, not triumphant. The last thing he wanted was to turn a boundary into a banner. "Thank you for keeping your lines," Susan added, surprising him. Her counselor says consequences taught her more than comfort ever did. They didn't say Vanessa's name again, not out of pettiness, but because sometimes mercy is a pronoun. The orders stayed in place, unglamorous and effective, like well-fitted lids on simmering pots. Service, in both senses, became routine. Papers renewed when needed, emails filed, incidents, few now, logged with the same steady hand Ethan used to record nightly sales. "Boring is a milestone," Jake said when they met for coffee, flicking a glance at the door with a detective's reflex that never sleeps. It means the story is obeying gravity again. Ethan and Lindsay learned the choreography of a life that doesn't require spectacle to feel real. They set a small calendar for things that matter and tend to drift: budget talks, family check-ins, a monthly dinner somewhere too quiet to impress anyone, which made the weather of their weeks feel forecastable without becoming rigid. Intentional doesn't mean performative, Lindsay said, penciling in the first Sunday for nothing but a long walk and soup. He wrote soup into his phone with the satisfaction of a manager who knows that naming the task is half the task. At Murphy's, the neon still couldn't decide whether it was optimistic or tired. That ambiguity felt like home rather than warning now. They took the same two stools where they'd first said slow out loud and ordered sodas with lime, because early mornings still called them to hill trails and coffee in travel mugs. Mara toasted them with water and said, "To ordinary that lasts," which everyone agreed was the best wish at the table. Sam asked when the bachelor party was and whether he should prepare a speech about form before spectacle. Ethan told him to save the sermon for the toast. Work remained a mercy and a mirror. There were still nights when the expo station shook with the thrum of a city hungry for its own myth, and others when the room hummed like a kitchen after staff meal, content, unhurried, competent. He hired 2 new servers and taught them the ethic of the place: clarity over charm, eye contact over flair, a water refill before the ask. He added a note to the training binder, a line he'd stolen from Lindsay's clinic and made his own: de-escalate first, decide second. On a Sunday that smelled like cinnamon and wet leaves, they met Susan at a cafe away from any of the old haunts. She arrived with a tin of cookies and a visible effort to keep her hands open on the table. "I wanted to see the people my daughter has been talking about in therapy," she said, making the sentence courageous by refusing to varnish it. "I'm trying to learn the difference between smoothing and supporting." Lindsay nodded with the professional empathy she wore like a well-used tool belt. "Sometimes you have to let the muscle shake while it gets stronger," she offered, and Susan exhaled in a way that made the tin rattle softly. They didn't trade war stories. They traded logistics. How to route calls to voicemails that get read by counselors rather than exes. How to direct future congratulations into channels that don't reopen old doors. How to keep kindness from turning into currency in a market that had already been closed. Susan left with an extra cookie and a kind of relief that makes a person taller. "Thank you for your lines," she said again at the curb. Wedding planning turned out to be an exercise in boundaries disguised as taste. "Courthouse and dinner," Lindsay suggested first, half serious, eyes bright with the freedom of small. "Small under a tree," Ethan countered, picturing light through leaves, the smell of rosemary on his fingertips, a handful of humans who could listen without performing. They made a list that looked like them. No speeches except the ones that happen over dishwashing, no wedding party beyond the 2 of them, a photographer whose portfolio was mostly quiet hands and low ceilings. "If we do this right," Lindsay said, "no one will cry because they're overwhelmed. They'll smile because they recognize us." The night before the wedding, Ethan stood alone in the restaurant after close and let the room tell him what it had learned. He ran a towel along the pass, checked the corners for the little messes that expand if you leave them, wrote a note for the opening shift that began, "Thank you," and meant it. He set a single place at the bar with a plate, fork, knife, and folded napkin, not as an altar to absence, but as a joke only he got. Even joy benefits from Missy en place. On the chalkboard he wrote the next day's specials and then, smaller at the bottom corner, "Ordinary served warm." They married under an oak with polite shade, and a breeze that knew how to arrive and leave without comment. Jake stood back and watched the perimeter the way men who have seen things always do, and then put his hands in his pockets when he realized nobody was coming to test the lines. Mara cried exactly once at a joke about mortgage rates. Sam held the rings like he was spotting a lift. Someone's child ran through the background like punctuation, which felt right because life had never asked their permission to keep moving. They kissed, and it was not a performance. It was an accurate report. After, they served soup and bread and salad like it was a weeknight with better napkins. There was no first dance, only the kind of swaying people do when they're talking and forget to sit, and the music was a playlist Lindsay's patience had made for her years ago that she'd kept because it sounded like people trying. At some point, the sun did what it always does, and someone said look without needing to capture it, and the moment entered memory without being forced. In the months that followed, the house learned new roots, where the laundry baskets lived when two people shared the load, how grocery lists shape themselves around rituals you keep, which mornings want pancakes and which prefer eggs. The restraining orders remained uneventful, renewing with the bureaucratic grace of forms that do exactly what they promise. Occasionally, a story about Vanessa's progress reached them, therapy kept, work resumed, accountability practiced without applause, and they let those stories be weather reports from a different county. On an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that would have been impossible to reach before, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with coffee and wrote on an index card, a habit he'd borrowed from the restaurant's prep sheets. He listed 3 truths that didn't need witnesses. 1. Love is logistics plus language. 2. Kindness without boundaries is fuel for fires. 3. Friendship is clarity, not access. He stuck the card to the inside of the cabinet next to the mugs, beside the phrase he'd lived into: de-escalate first, decide second. That night, closing the restaurant, he walked the line, touched each station, thanked it the way a surgeon might touch instruments after a long operation. Outside, Nashville did what cities do, sang, stumbled, sparkled in places, slept hard in others, and he locked the door with a motion his hands could do in the dark. He thought of the first time he'd said sure to a demotion, not knowing that agreement would become a template for a better yes. On the way home, he stopped at Murphy's for a soda and nodded toward the stool where a different version of him had sat and learned the definition of ordinary. At home, Lindsay had left a note by the sink, nothing dramatic, just a menu for tomorrow, and in joke about soup, a sketch of a ring that looked more like a circle because neither of them knew how to draw. He put the note under a magnet shaped like a basil leaf and turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, the apartment did not whisper warnings. It held its breath with them and then released it. He slid into bed and felt Lindsay's hand find his with the accuracy of a habit, and the day closed like a door on hinges that had been oiled on schedule. Before sleep, he ran the definition one more time, like a line check before service. Friendship, clarity, not access. Love, access granted by clarity, renewed by choice. An ordinary, finally, not a demotion but a room with windows open, a table set for 2, soup simmering, phones face down, yes kept small enough to hear. Phones face down, yes kept small enough to hear.